My husband handed me divorce papers in front of 500 guests at our anniversary gala. While the cameras flashed, he smiled and ended my life on stage. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just stared at the man I built an empire with and realized he'd already stolen everything. My name, my shares, my company. Gone. All before dessert was served. But that night, while everyone laughed, I made a silent promise. He would regret ever calling me his wife, because the next time we stood in a ballroom, he'd be the one losing everything. It's strange how you can spend years building a life with someone, only to watch it collapse in a single evening. That night was supposed to be perfect, our 10th anniversary. A black tie gala at the Bella Vista, the kind of venue where crystal chandeliers drip like tears from the ceiling and the champagne never stops flowing. I'd spent months planning it, every flower, every table setting, every whispered promise of luxury. I wanted the night to remind Ethan, my husband, of who we were before the boardrooms, before the press headlines, before the quiet wars that crept into our marriage. But that night, he reminded me of something else instead. He reminded me of how cruel love can be when it hides behind a perfect smile. The guests were already arriving when I stepped out of the dressing room. My reflection stared back at me from the gilded mirror. Sleek black gown, diamond earrings, a soft wave in my hair. I looked like a woman who had everything. But inside, I was a storm. I caught a glimpse of Ethan across the hall, tall, tailored, charming as ever. He had that practiced smile he used in business meetings, the one that could make or break million-dollar deals. When his eyes met mine, he didn't smile like a husband. He smiled like a stranger who'd already decided something I didn't know yet. I should have noticed the distance in his gaze then. I should have felt the ice in his handshake when he kissed my cheek. But I didn't, because I wanted that night to be beautiful. The music swelled as the lights dimmed. Guests raised their glasses, old friends, business partners, people who once swore they loved us together. I stood beside Ethan as the host introduced us to the couple who defines success and devotion, Ethan and Isabella Moore. Applause filled the ballroom. Cameras flashed. I smiled, pretending I didn't see the tension in his jaw. When I looked up at him, he was already checking his watch. Something inside me cracked quietly, like glass under pressure. It's funny how we sense the beginning of the end, before it ever happens. As dinner was served, Ethan barely spoke to me. He was seated between his vice president, Richard, and his company's new communications director, a young woman with red lips and eyes that lingered a little too long on him. I noticed how she leaned close when she laughed, how his hand brushed hers when they exchanged words. It was so small, so deliberate, so cruel. When she glanced my way, her smile was the kind that says, "I know something you don't." My throat tightened. I took a sip of champagne, forcing a smile for the cameras circling us. Inside, I was counting heartbeats, watching every gesture, memorizing every whisper. Halfway through the evening, Ethan stood up and tapped his glass for attention. The orchestra quieted. The lights shifted. Every eye turned to him. I thought, maybe he's going to make a toast. Maybe, after all the distance, he's finally going to tell me he still loves me. Instead, he cleared his throat and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a white envelope, thick, heavy, official, and as he handed it to me, his voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "Isabella, I think it's time we end this. Happy anniversary." The room went silent. I stared at the envelope in my hand, the words blurring through tears I refused to let fall. "Divorce papers, on our anniversary." He didn't even stay to explain. He turned, nodded to someone, Richard maybe, and walked out through the golden doors like a man leaving a business meeting, not a marriage. I remember the weight of that moment pressing down on me, my heartbeat thudding in my ears, my pride screaming not to cry in front of them all. So I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, while the whispers began. Did she know? Maybe he's been seeing someone else. I heard about that redhead at his office. Each voice sliced into me, clean and merciless. If you feel that sharp, private kind of betrayal right now, do one thing for me. Hit subscribe without thinking twice. Don't let stories like mine be forgotten because people scroll past. If you won't subscribe, go ahead. Type in the comments right now why you won't. I'm watching. The young woman, the one with red lips, stood up quietly and slipped out after him. That's when the truth hit me, cold and sharp. He wasn't leaving just me. He was walking into her arms. I felt my chest tighten, my world tilt, my own reflection fading under the ballroom lights. I walked toward the balcony, slow, composed, holding those papers like a prop in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Outside, New York glittered beneath me. The skyline shimmered in the cold night air, lights blinking like the pulse of a city that doesn't care who's bleeding. I leaned against the marble railing, listening to the faint echo of violins inside. 10 years of my life. Gone with one envelope. Every page was perfectly typed, signed, dated. He'd already decided everything, the settlement, the properties, even which friends would remain mutual. He'd written my ending before I even knew the story had begun. That's when I stopped crying, not because the pain disappeared, but because anger arrived. Cold, focused, electric. It whispered, "He doesn't get to end this story. I do." When I walked back inside, people pretended not to look. I smiled anyway, a slow, deliberate smile that made a few of them uneasy. I found Richard near the bar, his glass halfway to his lips. When he saw me coming, his eyes widened, guilt written all over his face. "Tell Ethan," I said quietly, "that he should have waited until morning." He blinked. What? But I was already walking away, because I didn't know how, but I knew I was going to destroy him. Not his life, his empire. If the thought of a man using someone's life like paper makes your skin crawl, press subscribe now. Don't let him get away with writing over people. If you refuse, leave a comment explaining why you'll let this slide. I want to read your reasons. The night after the gala, I couldn't sleep. New York hummed outside my window. Sirens, laughter, the restless pulse of a city that never grieves. Inside our penthouse, silence wrapped around me like frost, the kind of silence that only comes after something inside you dies. His clothes were still in the closet. His cologne still lingered in the hallway. Everything looked the same, except for me. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the divorce papers under the lamplight. My signature line waited like an execution order. 10 years, and all he needed was ink. I thought about calling him, to ask why, to demand a reason, but I already knew it wouldn't matter. People like Ethan don't offer explanations, they offer outcomes. So instead, I called my lawyer, not to sign anything, but to stall, to make him wonder what I was planning, because I wasn't going to let him think I'd crumble that easily. By morning, the media had it. Tech mogul Ethan Moore files for divorce from philanthropist wife at anniversary gala. Every outlet carried the headline. Some speculated about infidelity. Others painted me as the gold-plated victim of a billionaire's boredom. I scrolled through the articles, my coffee untouched, reading the comments like tiny knives. She'll walk away rich. Why cry? Probably cheated first. Guess he traded up. That was the moment humiliation turned into resolve. 2 days later, I went back to Ethan's company building. More dynamics. The guards still greeted me politely. They didn't know I was no longer the CEO's wife. The news hadn't reached the lobby yet. I walked through the glass doors, past the portraits of Ethan smiling beside world leaders, investors, and tech prodigies. He'd built an empire on charm and calculation, but I'd been there for every late-night call, every desperate pivot, every investor he'd begged. Half of what he owned carried my fingerprints. When I opened his computer, yes, I still knew his password, I found the first crack in his empire. Emails, hidden folders, transfers. He'd been moving company funds through offshore accounts for months under Clara's signature. That wasn't romance, that was conspiracy. And suddenly I saw my path. If I could prove he was laundering money or falsifying reports, the board would turn on him. Everything he'd built, the company, the reputation, the legacy, would collapse overnight. If you want someone who abuses trust to be exposed, subscribe right now. Don't be the person who watches and does nothing. If you decide not to subscribe, type in the comments why you'd choose silence over truth. I'll pin the most honest answers. I copied every file onto a drive, slipped it into my purse, and walked out without looking back. That night, I went to see my mother in Queens. She'd always warned me about Ethan. "Charm fades faster than loyalty," she used to say. When I told her what happened, she just looked at me. No pity, no surprise, and said softly, "Then don't cry. Count your cards." That phrase echoed in my head for days. Count your cards. Because even when you think you've lost, Sometimes you're still holding the ace. Weeks passed. The tabloids moved on, but I didn't. I spent my days pretending to heal, and my nights tracing Ethan's emails, memorizing every transaction, every name. And one night, one quiet, rainy night, I found something that made my hands shake. A hidden folder labeled Foundation Reports Private. Inside were documents showing that Ethan had been funneling charity donations into shell companies owned by Clara. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was defrauding the same causes we'd built together. Children's hospitals, scholarship funds, all of it, a front for their greed. That discovery burned hotter than any heartbreak. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about justice. Still, I couldn't expose him yet, not without a plan that would bury him so deep he'd never claw his way back. So I smiled when reporters asked how I was coping. I smiled when acquaintances offered pity, and I smiled when I saw photos of him and Clara splashed across magazines under captions like Power Couple 2.0, because they had no idea what was coming. This next part matters more than any gossip column. If you believe abusers should be held to account, hit subscribe now. Don't give them the silence they rely on. If you won't, write why in the comments and explain what you're protecting by staying quiet. One evening I returned to the penthouse to collect the rest of my things. The doorman hesitated but handed me my old keycard. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. Clara's perfume, her clothes draped over my vanity chair, her laughter echoing faintly from the bedroom. They were there. I heard water running, the shower, and Ethan's voice humming under his breath. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just walked to the study, opened the safe, and took what was mine. The original shares of More Dynamics I'd kept from our early days. Then I left, quietly, unseen, while the ghosts of my own life laughed behind the bathroom door. Outside, rain blurred the city lights. Each drop felt like time washing away what was left of the woman I used to be. I hailed a cab, opened my laptop, and started writing a list, not of people to blame, but of people to contact. Journalists, auditors, board members who hated Ethan's arrogance. Every name was a matchstick. All I needed was a spark. He thought he'd handed me divorce papers. He didn't realize he'd handed me evidence. If someone humiliated you publicly like that, would you strike back or walk away? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next chapter, Ethan's empire begins to crack, and he never sees who's holding the hammer. The night I left the penthouse, something inside me clicked. It wasn't peace, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was precision, a cold, surgical focus that stripped the pain out of my veins and replaced it with purpose. Ethan had his empire. I had his blueprints. In the days that followed, I moved like a ghost through New York, unseen, unheard, calculating. My first step was simple: information. Every morning, I'd sit in a small cafe downtown, the kind of place no one from our old life would ever visit, and study More Dynamics' stock reports. Numbers don't lie, not when you know how to read them, and I knew them better than anyone. After all, I'd spent a decade ghostwriting his success. But something was off. The company's quarterly report claimed record profits. Yet the transactions I'd seen in his private files told a different story. I needed proof that the board would believe, so I reached out to someone who owed me a favor. Melissa Trent, a financial journalist I'd once helped secure an interview with Ethan years ago. When I called her, she hesitated. Isabella, this sounds like revenge. It's not revenge if it's the truth. We met that evening in a quiet rooftop bar overlooking the East River. The skyline flickered around us like a confession waiting to happen. I slid a flash drive across the table. There's enough in there to start a story. Just don't use my name. She nodded slowly. If this is what I think it is, Isabella, he's in deep. That's the idea. If you want to be part of something that proves the truth matters, subscribe right now. Don't hesitate. If you're the kind of person who watches and does nothing, tell us why in the comments. Explain your inaction. I read every single one. 2 days later, the headline dropped. Anonymous source claims fraud inside More Dynamics. The article didn't name Ethan directly, but the damage was done. Stockholders panicked. Reporters camped outside the company headquarters. And Ethan, for the first time in years, looked scared. I watched the footage on TV, sipping tea in my quiet apartment, as he stood at a podium denying everything. The same voice that once whispered "I love you" was now fighting for control of a crumbling empire, and I felt nothing, just quiet satisfaction. That night, Melissa called. Her voice trembled. "Isabella, there's something you need to see. The files you gave me. They reference another account, one under your name." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, under my name?" "He's been using your old foundation account as part of the transfers. If this blows up, you'll be implicated too." So that was his plan. He hadn't just cheated on me or humiliated me, he'd framed me as his accomplice. He wanted me ruined if he ever fell. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. Rain lashed the windows, matching the storm in my chest. Every memory of him, every whispered promise, every "trust me," suddenly looked like manipulation wearing love's mask. He hadn't left me because he stopped loving me. He left because I'd served my purpose. He'd used my charity, my reputation, my name to shield his crimes. And when the foundation was no longer useful, he handed me divorce papers to cut the liability clean. But he'd miscalculated, because now I had nothing left to lose. I called Melissa back. "Can you trace where the money from that account went?" "Already on it," she said. "But if you're tied to this, then I'll untie myself." The next morning, I went to see someone I never thought I'd face again, Daniel Mercer, the company's former CFO. He'd been fired 3 years ago for breach of trust, but I knew the truth. He'd found out too much. When I showed up at his modest office in Brooklyn, he looked surprised but not unwelcome. "Mrs. Moore, to what do I owe the honor?" "Call me Isabella, and I think we both know why I'm here." For hours, we pored over old ledgers and archived documents, the air thick with stale coffee and old anger. Daniel had copies of everything. Emails Ethan thought he'd deleted, audit trails he'd buried under fake subsidiaries. When he pulled out a folder labeled Foundation Allocations, my pulse quickened. Inside were signatures, mine, authorizing transfers I'd never seen. He'd forged them, all of them. And next to each forged transfer, a confirmation email to Clara. They weren't just lovers, they were partners in crime. Daniel looked at me carefully. "You realize if you take this public, it'll destroy him, but it'll drag you through the mud too." "I don't care about mud, Daniel. I care about truth." He nodded slowly. "Then you'll need more than paper. You'll need a confession." That night as I drove home, his words echoed in my mind, a confession. Ethan was careful, too careful. But Clara, she was ambitious, impulsive. And ambition always talks too much when it thinks it's safe. So I decided to make her feel safe. The next evening, I sent Clara a message from a private account. "We both know Ethan isn't loyal. Meet me tomorrow. I can help you protect yourself." She replied within minutes. "Where?" We met at a hotel lounge downtown. She looked even younger up close, nervous, trying to look composed, her red lipstick a little too bold for the fear in her eyes. "You said you had information?" "I do. But first, tell me something, Clara. Did he promise you the company?" She hesitated. "He said he'd make me partner after the merger." I smiled sadly. "That's what he told me too." She blinked. "You?" "Yes. I was the woman before you, the one who built the empire you think you're inheriting." Her confidence cracked. "You're lying." I slid a photo across the table, a printout of one of the forged documents with her email copied in. "I don't need to lie, Clara, but when the SEC comes knocking, I'll make sure they know who actually pressed send." Her eyes widened. Panic flickered. "He said you'd take the fall. That's why." "Why what?" "He said you'd already signed everything. That the foundation was your idea, that he was covering for you." I froze. That was the proof. She'd admitted it, recorded on my phone sitting face down on the table. The confession Daniel said I'd need. As she stormed out, muttering excuses, I sat there, numb. It was done. I had everything. The files, the emails, the confession. And yet, I didn't feel victorious, because part of me still remembered the man who once kissed my forehead before every board meeting, who said, "We're unstoppable together." Maybe that's the cruelest part of betrayal. You don't just lose love, you lose the version of yourself that believed in it. But as I looked out at the rain-slick streets, I made myself a promise. If I was going to lose that version of me, I'd make sure he lost everything else. If you discovered your partner framed you for their crimes, what would you do? If you believe no one should be able to weaponize your name, hit subscribe now. One click keeps stories like mine from being buried. If you won't subscribe, say so in the comments and tell us what you value more than truth. The morning of the emergency board meeting felt like the moment before a performance. The hush when the house lights drop and everyone leans forward. Only this was no performance. This was a reckoning. Ethan had no idea what I'd done. He thought the anonymous article and market panic were the worst of it. He thought hiding and denials would buy him time. He'd built a life around the belief that he could manage perception. But perception crumbles when the paper trail is long enough and sharp enough to cut. I arrived early. The boardroom at More Dynamics had always felt like a courtroom and a chapel at once. Polished wood, high-backed chairs, the kind of lighting that makes confessions look cinematic. The board filtered in like actors taking their places. Some faces were familiar friends, others merely useful acquaintances who'd flocked to wherever the air smelled richest. Melissa, quiet and controlled, sat at a corner table with her recording device. Daniel had slipped in earlier. His face was a mask of something like apology crossed with resolve. Ethan's allies sat shoulder to shoulder, a human shield he thought would protect him. I walked in with my files folded under my arm, breathing in the cold air, feeling the letters of my name like a brand. Olivia Moore, co-founder, majority shareholder. At the head of the table, Ethan smiled the easy smile he used for speeches. He looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because he'd stopped being a man and started being a spectacle. He stood to begin, and the room quieted. The board expected his usual dominance, the casual charm that made men nod and women forgive. He spoke first with that practiced cadence. Let's keep this professional. But I'd already decided this wouldn't be a meeting about management. It would be about truth. When my turn came, I didn't rise like an accused person. I rose like an owner. Before we proceed, I said, voice steady, I have some documents the board needs to see. I placed the old incorporation papers on the table. The room hummed. Someone, bored, arrogant, reached to push them aside, but Ethan's attorney paled as he read the notarized stamp, the date, the signatures, my name, Olivia Moore, the majority shareholder, 51%. The weight of it hit the room like a thrown stone. You can't be serious, Ethan said, the charm slipping to something raw, angrier. Those are outdated drafts. They don't reflect later agreements. I smiled. They're legally binding unless replaced by a later notarized document, which, funny enough, I've been searching for, and I found plenty of later documents that appear less than legitimate. Then I pushed the flash drives across the table, meticulously labeled, time-stamped, verified by auditors who'd agreed to meet the SEC contingent that evening. Melissa stood. She clicked her recorder on and played the audio. Clara's voice, the one who thought she was untouchable, admitting transactions and naming accounts. Daniel stepped forward with bank statements, emails, and transfer logs. Ethan's face drained a color I'd never seen on him, the color of someone realizing his safety net had holes. The boardroom erupted into questions, accusations. Ethan tried the old tricks. Deflection, indignation, threats, but the data kept coming, incontrovertible and clean. Investors, previously loyal, whispered about liability. When the first board member stood to call for an independent audit, I felt an ember of triumph. The thing I'd wanted, his fall in the light, had started. Ethan's voice grew ragged. He called for a recess, for private counsel, for anything that would buy him time. But I had already done the impossible. I'd summoned the SEC. I'd made the call weeks earlier, timed their arrival for the exact moment of public unraveling. I didn't want a quiet resignation. I wanted a public, undeniable accountability. Police presence in the corridor was subtle at first. Plainclothes men and women taking notes. Then the men in suits from the securities division arrived, badges flashing, calm and clinical. The lead investigator entered, nodded to the board, and said 3 words that felt like a verdict. We're opening an investigation. Ethan's world unraveled faster than gossip. He tried to stand, to command, to seduce the narrative, but men in suits asked questions, not favor. They asked for ledgers, for access, for keys to locked drives. They asked the kind of questions no PR script can answer. As they led Ethan to a private room for questioning, he glared at me, a look that held everything. Betrayal, disbelief, fury. But the feeling that washed over me first was not triumph. It It was a hollow, ancient ache, like opening the door to a room you once loved and finding only echoes. And then the floor shifted under my feet in a way I hadn't planned for. Because the lead investigator, calm, professional, almost mechanical, folded out a piece of paper and read aloud, slowly, as if tasting each syllable. Miss Moore, we have reason to believe some of the transactions include beneficiary accounts tied to another person, a third party who may be innocent. We need to ask, can you confirm the identity of the person registered on these accounts? There is a name here, Edith Alvarez, that matches an identity record we have on file. My mother's name. The room stilled. My hands went numb. The investigator's tone softened, but the words that followed were knives. We have a warrant to present. There will be further inquiries. We may need to contact Ms. Alvarez. My vision tunneled. The voices around me blurred into the hum of air conditioning. Daniel reached for my hand, his own face etched with regret. I didn't know. He said he didn't know. I believed him. I had to, because there was no room left for betrayal right now. My mother who had sung lullabies in a queen's apartment, who'd never hurt a soul, was suddenly implicated in a crime she did not understand. I excused myself and slipped into the nearest bathroom. The mirror reflected a stranger, a woman whose jaw had hardened into a line I barely recognized. Tears welled hot and bright, but I swallowed them down. There was no time for that. My plan had been surgical. I had not imagined that his collapse would land on the people I loved the most. In that chrome-lit stall, I made another decision. I would not let him weaponize my family. Whatever it took, I would shield them, even if it meant losing the last piece of myself in the process. I left the bathroom and re-entered the chaos with a calm I did not feel. Cameras circled, microphones prodded, reporters smelled blood. Ethan was being escorted to a room where he could no longer charm the world with words. The lead investigator approached me again. Miss Moore, for now, we need to interview witnesses. It may be best if you come with us. My stomach turned. The boardroom had gone from battlefield to courtroom. My hands trembled as I stood. As I walked past Ethan, his eyes met mine. He said nothing, but in his silence was a confession that tasted like ash. They took me downtown for questioning. Cameras followed. The headlines would come fast. Would the truth free me or bury my mother? Would the empire I set on fire consume the people I loved along with it? Because in the next chapter, the aftermath, I will have to choose between justice and protection, and neither option is clean. If you value truth but fear the cost to the innocent, subscribe now and stand with those who choose protection over silence. If you won't, tell us in the comments which side you would pick. I promise to read every answer. When you've been betrayed so cleanly, so publicly, something inside you learns to move like water, calm, shapeless, patient. I learned that in those sleepless nights after the gala, when every social headline screamed my humiliation in gold font. CEO hands wife divorce papers during anniversary gala. They called it bold, unprecedented. Some even called it romantic honesty. But what none of them knew, not the tabloids, not the polished journalists who smiled through my pain, was that I had already set a quiet storm in motion. New York didn't look the same after that night. The city lights felt colder, sharper, like they were cutting through the illusion of perfection we'd built together. Thomas, my husband, still walked into his skyscraper office each morning with the arrogance of a man untouched by consequence. But beneath that steel and glass facade, his empire had begun to rot. Because I'd planted the seeds, months before the gala, when I still loved him, when I still thought redemption was possible. He never noticed how often I asked about the company's foundations, the deals, the silent partners, the hidden accounts he thought I didn't understand. I'd studied him for years, not just the man, but the businessman. And when the betrayal came, I knew exactly which walls to tap, which threads to pull. It started small, a whisper among investors, a rumor about mismanagement, a single unsigned email to a journalist. I didn't need to destroy him loudly. I just needed to introduce silence into his empire. The silence grew. Within weeks, the board called for an emergency meeting. Stock values began to flicker like dying candles. And Thomas began to sweat. He'd always been confident, too confident. But now I saw the cracks behind his charm. I watched from a distance, from behind sunglasses and calm expressions, as he tried to plug holes in a sinking ship. At a charity dinner, the same kind of event where we used to stand arm in arm, I saw him laughing too loudly, shaking hands too long. He was performing stability, pretending not to hear the whispers around him. And I stood there, smiling politely, holding a glass of champagne I didn't drink, watching the show. Need to confront him. I didn't need to scream, I just had to wait. The night the first headline broke, I was in my apartment, alone, staring at the skyline. The story read, "Internal audit reveals financial discrepancies in McAllister Group." Thomas's last name, our name, he called me that night, the first time in months. His voice was shaky, breathless, full of false calm. "Clara, did you do this?" I didn't lie. I didn't confirm either. "I told you, Thomas," I said softly. "There are consequences for cruelty." He laughed nervously. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk everything just to spite me." But that's the thing. I wasn't risking anything anymore. He'd already taken everything. All that was left was the truth. By the end of the week, 2 major investors had withdrawn. The CFO resigned. His board turned cold. His name started to appear in the kind of headlines he used to smirk at. Scandal, fraud, infidelity, instability. And I stayed silent. Always silent. Because silence is what power sounds like when you've been broken and rebuilt. There was one night I'll never forget, when he showed up at my door. Rain pouring, suit soaked, face pale like he'd seen a ghost. He didn't knock at first. He just stood there. I saw him through the glass, shoulders trembling. Pride finally cracked. When I opened the door, he looked at me the way you look at something you can't buy back. "Clara," he whispered, "you've won. Just stop, please." But I didn't speak. I just looked at him, the man who handed me divorce papers like they were dessert menus. And for the first time, I saw what fear looked like on him. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't triumphant. It was empty. Because revenge doesn't always taste like victory. Sometimes it just tastes like ashes. And in that silence, I realized I hadn't destroyed him to free myself. I'd destroyed him because I didn't know how else to end the pain. And that's not power. That's grief. Wearing perfume. There's a strange quiet that follows destruction. Not peace, not relief, just quiet. The kind that sits in your chest and asks, "Now what?" Weeks passed after that night on my doorstep. Thomas disappeared from the headlines as quickly as he had ruled them. His empire fractured into pieces, sold off, dissected, forgotten. The same board that once toasted him in penthouses now erased his name from their lips. He called a few more times. I never answered. Not because I didn't want to hear his voice, but because I was afraid of what it might still do to me. Revenge feels righteous in motion, but when it's done, all that's left is you. You, the ashes, and the echo of what you thought would save you. I tried to go back to normal things. Mornings in cafes, painting, walking through Central Park in the early mist. But everywhere I went, I saw ghosts of who we used to be. The woman who once wore diamonds and smiled at flashbulbs. The man who whispered promises in the back seat of black cars. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking for him in crowds, as if part of me still expected him to show up, smiling, arrogant, whole. But the man I loved no longer existed. Maybe he never did. One morning, an envelope arrived. No return address. Just my name, in his handwriting. Inside, one photograph. The 2 of us, standing at the anniversary gala, frozen mid-laughter, before everything collapsed, before the papers. And on the back, in small, uneven letters, he'd written, "You were always the smart one." That was all. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But the tears never came. Instead, I set the photo down beside the window, sunlight bleeding through it, and I realized something. In trying to end him, I'd also ended the version of me that believed love could save everything. That belief was gone now, burned away, replaced by something quieter, steadier. I moved apartments a few months later, smaller, higher up, overlooking the East River. No marble floors, no expensive silence. Just the hum of life outside my window. People still whispered when they recognized me. Some called me ruthless, some called me brave, but none of them understood the truth, that I didn't do it for power. I did it because grief needed somewhere to go, and now there was nowhere left for it to land. Sometimes at night I still see the flash of cameras, hear the echo of crystal glasses clinking. I see him handing me those papers with that smug little smile. But then the memory shifts. He's the one holding the ruin now, and I'm just walking away. They say every empire falls the same way, first with noise, then with silence, then with forgetting. And that's how it ended. Not with screams, not with vengeance, but with the soft sound of a woman finally learning to stop looking back. If you've ever loved someone who mistook your kindness for weakness, remember this: the calmest revenge isn't destruction. It's indifference. Don't let them hear your pain. Let them hear your silence. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever stood in the middle of a storm and pretended to be calm while everything inside you shattered, then do one thing. Subscribe now. Don't think. Hit the button, because silence is exactly what people like him hope for. And if you won't subscribe, write in the comments why you won't. Explain your choice. I read every story, every scar, because somewhere out there, another heart is learning how to stay silent too.